Okay, this metabolic efficiency test was done on a 16-year-old male triathlete. Now, below you can see the data table, which includes the stage duration. So every 4 minutes, the speed increased. You can see we started at a 7.1 mile per hour, which is an 8:27 minute per mile pace with this young athlete, and finished at an 8.6 mile per hour or a 6:59 minute per mile pace. You can also see his heart rate, which I recorded down below. Now, the red line indicates the percent fat being used for energy, and the black line indicates the percent carbohydrate being used for energy. So this athlete is classified as being a level 2 metabolic efficiency level because he had a metabolic efficiency point. Now, it happened early on, but he did have one, which happened at an 8:07 minute per mile pace and a heart rate of 146 beats per minute. So let's talk a little bit about this because a lot of times I feel like people classify these tests as good or bad. There is no such thing. We need to do these in order to learn more about how efficient or inefficient the body is at using different nutrients, in this particular case, carbohydrate and fat. Now, let's put this into context. Whenever I work with young athletes, I always have to take into consideration what stage of puberty they are in. Are they pre-puberty, puberty, or post-puberty? Because that will dictate a lot of the different nutrition recommendations and strategies that I provide. Because the number one goal for young athletes from a nutrition perspective is to support growth and development from a muscular standpoint, skeletal standpoint, and a cognitive or brain standpoint. Now, this young athlete, 16-year-old, was right in the middle of puberty. So you can imagine what's happening with a young male triathlete in puberty, burning a lot of calories, a lot of hormone fluctuations. Now, with this, putting this into context to the next level, the next question you should have is, well, he's a triathlete. What distances is he doing? Well, his distances that he specializes in is super sprint distance, which is half a sprint triathlon, and sprint distance. Now, if you know about those, and if you know kind of a highly competitive young triathletes, they're finishing these really anywhere between about 30 to 60 minutes for the most part. There are some outliers on both sides, but what that tells us is that his intensity of racing is very high, very high. And we know with high intensity of any exercise, your body will need more carbohydrate because carbohydrate are the preferred source of energy at higher intensities. Now, we also have to keep in mind he's a young triathlete. So keep that in mind as we discuss this. But here's the other part of the context I want to share with you. His metabolic efficiency point at an 8:07 minute per mile pace, him running an 8:07 minute per mile is super easy. That is like the most conversational pace ever. So his race pace runs, at least usually, depending on the distance, super sprint or sprint, we're talking probably a sub 6 minute per mile. So what we see here is that his metabolic efficiency happened early on at a very slow pace for him. Now, if you would ask me, is that typical for a young athlete, for a young male triathlete? Well, there is no typical. There is no atypical. Everybody is extremely different from an individual perspective, genetics, how the body handles calories and process and absorbs calories, but also what's happening with the daily nutrition plan and his daily training plan. So there's so many factors here. So there's not a right or wrong, good or bad. What we do here is I look at this graph and I say, okay, this is interesting because at his race intensities, he's burning a lot of carbohydrates. And what we also know about young triathletes, especially in puberty, is in pre-puberty, is that they don't have all of their muscle stores. They don't have the quantity of muscle that they'll have later in life, like post-puberty. And because most of their carbohydrates are stored in muscle tissue, if they don't have a lot of their muscle yet formed, I mean, it's coming, don't get me wrong, but that's going to lead to less carbohydrate storage in most young athletes. And that's what we see. So a lot of young athletes actually need to eat more carbohydrate, not only for development, proper biological development, but also because they don't store as many carbohydrates. If their sport requires a higher intensity where they're burning more carbohydrates, and calories, like we see with this young athlete, then yes, they do need to eat a little bit more carbohydrate. Doesn't mean all carbohydrate, which I'll get to in a second, but they need to emphasize carbohydrate for sure. Now, remember again, the context. His distance of racing is will last anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes, right? He will have plenty of carbohydrate stores for anything under an hour. He should, absolutely, hands down. So, do we need to change much in terms of his efficiency? Do we need to move his metabolic efficiency? Not quite yet. Now, this is what I discussed with him also. If once he kind of enters post puberty, he gets more into his adult body, and he has developed his muscles, his muscle glycogen storage, carbohydrate storage. If his distances change, then yes, we do need to change his metabolic efficiency. For example, if he wants to do Olympic distance or half Ironman or even someday Ironman distances, yes, because he cannot be burning this many carbohydrates in a longer distance race because he will, quote unquote, bonk pretty easily because of the things I just mentioned. He doesn't have as many carbohydrate stores. He's burning through a lot of carbohydrate stores. So, really, for him, he would only need to change his metabolic efficiency to support more fat adaptation, fat burning, which means, by the way, he's preserving more of his carbohydrate if he were to go longer distance racing. Now, another thing to keep note is that with metabolic efficiency testing, I can get a whole bunch of data, and I like to pick and choose based on what's relevant to the athlete and put it into context. But what you see from this graph is how many calories he's burning per hour at specific intensities and where those calories are coming from. So, example, if we take that first stage, which is an 8:27 minute per mile, his heart rate was 142. That first stage, if he were to hold that pace, that intensity for 1 hour, he would burn 876 calories per hour. The black line, and you can see that on the blue line, the black line indicates the carbohydrate calories, and the red line or the red graph indicates the fat calories. Now, why is this important? Well, this is all over the board with individuals, and I've tested a lot of young athletes, a lot of young endurance athletes, and they are all over the board. Now, I will say this young individual has a very high burn rate, which means he's burning hot, his thermostat is high, he's burning a lot of calories at lower intensities, and with that needs to really configure a different nutrition plan because he's burning through a lot of carbohydrates, he's burning through a lot of calories, but again, remember, most of his race distances his races are under an hour. So again, he has enough carbohydrate to satisfy that until he decides to go up in distance. This is like the perfect storm, and I see this a lot with adult athletes also. The perfect storm is you start to increase your distance of training or racing, and you're a high calorie burner. You've got a high burn rate. All of a sudden, you start decreasing your energy because you can't make it, you can't go long, you don't have as many carbohydrates stored in your muscles potentially, but because you have a high calorie burn rate and a high carbohydrate burn rate, you need to constantly feed carbohydrates. And sometimes that works out, but a lot of the times it just increases the risk for GI distress symptoms. So again, everything is kind of put in context, but would I change his nutrition? Yes, in fact, I would. And we talked about it a little bit. And here's what I would change specifically. I really wanted him to focus more on that 3-to-1. So 3 hands of carbohydrate to 1 hand of protein most of his meals, right? Because again, he's in puberty, he's supporting development. He also is racing shorter distances. He is burning a lot of calories. So at this point in time, it really doesn't make sense to make him more fat adapted or metabolically efficient to the point of burning more fat for energy because his distances, his racing, his training doesn't support that right now. And he needs the carbohydrates to support development. Now, we did talk about on his off days, potentially going down to a 2-to-1, depending on his training schedule and what his coach is having him do. And we talked about off season. If he has an off season, maybe paring it down to a 2-to-1 carbohydrate to protein. But again, a lot of the nutrition recommendations for young athletes needs to consider their stage of development in the pubertal development stages. So you do not want a young athlete to underfeed calories or underfeed carbohydrate because those are very necessary. So for the time being, I guess at the end of the day, summarizing this, his nutrition is supporting what his body needs at this current time. Once he becomes post-pubertal or changes his race distances, he will definitely need to make a shift in his daily nutrition to favor a little bit more of blood sugar control to improve his metabolic efficiency in terms of allowing and teaching his body to burn more fat. So hopefully this is helpful. Stay tuned for the next metabolic efficiency test interpretation.